Absolutely. Thanks very much.
Okay, I'll make a brief opening statement. And this is about censorship, suppression, and the 2020 election. Sort of a deep dive when it comes to Twitter and Facebook about the platforms and the decisions they make, how they make them. Can we do better? Do we need to do better? So the first thing I want to talk about here is health risk associated with social media. A 2018 Pew Research Center survey of nearly 750 13 to 17-year-olds found that 45% are online almost constantly, and 97% use social media platforms such as YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, or Snapchat. So why are we having this hearing? The products that these two companies offer, people like and they use. So the bottom line is they've probably been more successful than their wildest dreams, and they're having to make decisions that offend people on the left and the right. And what we're trying to do is look at Section 230 and to see if it needs to be modified or changed, because Section 230 basically allows social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook to pass on information without legal liability. If a newspaper does something you don't like, or you think they've slandered you in a certain way, you can sue them. If a news program does something that you think is out of line, even as a politician with a high bar, you can sue them. These companies have liability protection when it comes to the content that their users engage in. You can sue the person who gave the tweet, but you can't sue Twitter, who gave that person access to the world in terms of what they said. And we got to find a way to make sure that when Twitter and Facebook make a decision about what's reliable and what's not, what to keep up and what to take down, that there's transparency in the system. And I think Section 230 has to be changed, because we can't get there from here without change. But in 2019, a study of more than 6,500 12 to 15-year-olds in the U.S. found that those who spent more than 3 hours a day using social media might be at heightened risk for mental health problems. Another study, 12,000 13 to 16-year-olds in England, found that using social media more than 3 times a day predicted poor mental health and well-being in teens. Other studies also have observed links between high levels of social media use, depression, or anxiety. The average millennial checks their phone 157 times daily. I don't know how a member of the Senate, I don't know where we fall. Social media is designed to sustain users' attention with a mix of good user interface design and psychology, creating an addictive mix for users. It's called the slot machine effect, a technique which utilizes a pull to refresh and scrolling mechanisms on news feeds similar to a slot machine. The like button, a feature to provide social validation through a positive feedback loop by measuring and comparing the number of likes a user's content obtains. Gamifying social interactions, employing gamification to engage users and keep them coming back. For example, streaks is the one causing the most concern, and using elongating red lines to display the number of days since 2 users interacted. Guess what these technologies do is try to keep us engaged. The more we engage the technology, the more advertising benefit to the company. Is that a good business practice? Maybe so. Does it create a health hazard over time? Something to look at. Now, the other aspect of this debate is, are these companies newspapers or their TV stations? Do they have the power of media organizations that have rules and regulations, and the current media platforms do not? There are rules about what a television station can do. There are rules about what a newspaper can do. And what I want to try to find out is if you're not a newspaper at Twitter or Facebook, then why do you have editorial control over the New York Post? They decided, and maybe for a good reason, I don't know, that the New York Post articles about Hunter Biden needed to be flagged, excluded from distribution, or made hard to find. That to me seems like you're the ultimate editor. The editorial decision at the New York Post to run the story was overridden by Twitter and Facebook in different fashions to prevent its dissemination. Now, if that's not making an editorial decision, I don't know what would be. It's one thing when we do it in our private lives. Nikki Haley made a post about her concerns about mail-in balloting. It was flagged as something, a claim this hasn't been legitimized. Let me read it to you. The next question to ask is, why is it a crime to raise doubts about the Holocaust? Why should anyone who writes about such doubts be imprisoned while insulting the prophet is allowed? Now, that's the Ayatollah. He's opining that raising doubts about the Holocaust shouldn't be a crime, and he has openly called for the destruction of Israel. His regime has, and his tweet was basically allowed to flourish. Here's what Nikki Haley said. Despite what the media tells us, election fraud does happen, and policies like balloting, harvesting, and mailing ballots to people who don't request them makes that easier. That needs to stop. This claim about election fraud is disputed. Well, that's her opinion. She believes, like I do, that mail-in balloting is ripe for fraud if you can't verify the signature. And if we just send mail ballots out to the world that are not requested, and you don't have a signature verification system that can be trusted, you have in fact led to harvesting of ballots for nefarious purposes. The question for us as a country, at what point do the decisions by these organizations cross a line? At what point do they have to assume responsibility that Section 230 shields them from? And to the people who are about to testify, I consider your products to have changed the world mostly for the good. We're able to interact among ourselves. We're able to talk to each other and share life experiences. We're able to, in real time, communicate to our neighbors and our friends and those who oppose us what we think with technology that just makes it instantaneous and can literally light up the world. Section 230 was developed to allow these technologies to flourish. Early on, if you could sue Twitter or Facebook for content on a Facebook posting or a tweet, and they were liable for what somebody else said or what they felt or did, then the company would have probably never been in existence. The companies are trying to help us deal with child pornography. We have the Earn It Act that to be able to maintain liability protections when it comes to sexual exploitation of media sites, social media sites, by sexual predators. This committee has passed a bill saying you can only maintain that liability protection if, in fact, you use best business practices. And that's where I think we need to be going. My hope is that we change Section 230 to incentivize social media platforms to come up with standards that are transparent and opaque, that will allow us to make judgments about their judgments, that the fact checkers be known, that the community standards, who sets them, what are their biases, and give some direction to these companies because they have almost an impossible task. They're literally trying to engage in telling us what's reliable and what's not based on cable news commentary or tweets from politicians or average citizens. Nobody in a free society has ever had that responsibility before. And the question is, how do you control that responsibility? I don't want the government to take over the job of telling America what tweets are legitimate and what are not. I don't want the government deciding what content to take up and put down. I think we're all in that category. But when you have companies that have the power of governments, have far more power than traditional media outlets, something has to give. And I'm hoping in this hearing today that we can find a baseline of agreement, that Section 230 needs to be changed, that my bias would be to allow the industry itself to develop best business practices to protect the sites against terrorism and child exploitation and other concerns, that we look at the business practices of these companies through a health prism, that some of their practices need to be modified because it can become addictive. You know, we thought tobacco was a good thing for a long time to the point that we sent it to our soldiers in combat. The more we realized about the addictive nature of tobacco, the more we changed our mind about telling the public about the product. So whether or not we do that with social media platforms, that these platforms can be addictive if used too often, I don't know if we need to go there, but I do know that Section 230, it exists today, is got to give. And I think there's Republican and Democrat concern about the power that's being used by social media outlets to tell us what we can see and what we can't, what's true and what's not, to the extent that Section 230, in my view, has to be rewritten. So that's the purpose of this hearing, is to find a way forward to bring about change. And when it comes to social media platforms in Section 230, change is going to come. With that, Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing today. And I look forward to cooperating with you, not only in this hearing, but in the upcoming Congress on our Earn It bill, on other measures, because you're absolutely right. Change must come to social media. The fact is, we meet today in an unprecedented and precarious moment in American history. Daily, the president shocks our conscience and shakes the very foundations of our democracy using a powerful megaphone, social media. The president has used this megaphone to spread vicious falsehoods in an apparent attempt to overturn the will of voters. Every day, he posts new threats and conspiracy theories about mail-in ballots and voting machines, lies that contradict his own election security officials and his lawyers. He uses this megaphone potentially to block a peaceful transition of power. Now, Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Dorsey, you have built terrifying tools of persuasion and manipulation with power far exceeding the robber barons of the last Gilded Age. You have profited hugely by strip mining data about our private lives and promoting hate speech and voter suppression. You have an immense civic and moral responsibility to ensure these instruments of influence do not irreparably harm our country. I recognize the steps, they're really baby steps, that you've taken so far. The destructive, incendiary misinformation is still a scourge on both your platforms and on others. In fact, Google has been given a pass from today's hearing. It's been rewarded by this committee for its timidity, doing even less than you have done to live up to its responsibilities. The recent actions you have taken, in fact, are simply to check the truth of what appears on platforms, Often it is voter suppression and incendiary, malicious misinformation, and you've tried to slow its insidious spread. That's not censorship. That's moral and civic responsibility. Now, I believe, and I hope the chairman agrees, that a series of hearings on big tech is long overdue on antitrust issues, on privacy concerns, and Section 230. I have urged, in fact, a breakup of tech giants because they've misused their bigness and power. Breaking off, for example, WhatsApp and Instagram. Rigorous privacy protection because consumers should have control over their own data. And indeed, Section 230 reform, meaningful reform, including even possible repeal in large part, because their immunity is way too broad, and victims of their harms deserve a day in court. But this hearing is certainly not the serious proceeding that we need. It may become a political sideshow, a public tar and feathering. My colleagues seem to want to ignore the foreign disinformation campaigns intended to interfere in our democracy and calls for murder of FBI Director Wray and Dr. Fauci. What we've seen here are fighting words and hate speech that certainly deserve no free expression protection. The fact is that the purpose of today's hearing seems as much to bully or browbeat you, Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Dorsey, from taking even more responsible action by threatening cuts to Section 230. Censorship is really a misnomer for this hearing. What you've done is to label and to fact check, to avoid amplifying misinformation, and to, in effect, impose those labels to alert people that what they are consuming may misinform them. And Facebook took down ads for Biden in Michigan and the ACLU in Colorado for mistaken information about voting. In short, there was action that affected both sides. I have fought for Section 230 reform for 16 years, from my time as Connecticut's Attorney General, when I took on the scourge of registered sex offenders grooming children on Facebook and MySpace with Senator Portman. I have led passage of the only successful revision so far to Section 230, the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, known as SESTA, and Chairman Graham and I have authored the only bill to reform Section 230 that is actually moved out of a committee. This section, the Earn It Act, passed this committee unanimously. Change is going to come, no question. Change is on the way, and I intend to bring aggressive and targeted reform to Section 230. But I am not, nor should we be on this committee, interested in being a member of the speech police. There are real harms and real victims here. And in some ways, this hearing is a betrayal of those real harms and the real victims of them. Those harms have been caused by big tech because you have failed your responsibility, as have others in this industry. I want to see real reform that will enable these abuses to be reformed, because your platforms have embraced, abused, and weaponized child predators, violent white supremacists, and human traffickers. And I've heard heart-wrenching stories from the victims. You've set back civil rights protections for Muslim Americans who live in fear of armed militias, organized by private online groups. You have set back consumers in competition, making that kind of antitrust action very, very important. The American public deserves and demands real reform and accountability, national consumer privacy rules, antitrust principles that curb predatory power, and reforms to Section 230 that stop shutting the courthouse door to victims. I look forward to an opportunity for real change, and I think you can meet this moment by putting your power and your money on the right side of history. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. Lot to unpack there. Senator Blumenthal's been great to work with. I'll continue to work with you. If we keep control of the committee, Senator Grassley would be the chairman next year, and I would encourage him to have the hearings that Senator Blumenthal referenced, that this is a ongoing conversation to get it right to the extent that we can get it right. Mr. Dorsey from Twitter, are you with us, Mr. Dorsey?
I am. You hear me?
Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you to the members of the Judiciary Committee for the opportunity to speak with the American people about Twitter and your concerns around censorship and suppression of a specific news article, and generally what we saw in the 2020 US elections conversation. We were called here today because of an enforcement decision we made against the New York Post based on a policy we created in 2018 to prevent Twitter from being used to spread hacked materials. This resulted in us blocking people from sharing a New York Post article publicly or privately. We made a quick interpretation using no other evidence that the materials in the article were obtained through hacking, and according to our policy, we blocked them from being spread. Upon further consideration, we admitted this action was wrong and corrected it within 24 hours. We informed the New York Post of our error and policy update and how to unlock their account by deleting the original violating tweet, which freed them to tweet the exact same content and news article again. They chose not to, instead insisting we reverse our enforcement action. We did not have a practice around retroactively overturning prior enforcements. This incident demonstrated that we needed one, and so we created one we believe is fair and appropriate. I hope this illustrates the rationale behind our actions and demonstrates our ability to take feedback, admit mistakes, and make changes, all transparently to the public. We acknowledge there are still concerns around how we moderate content, and specifically our use of Section 230. 3 weeks ago, we proposed 3 solutions to address the concerns raised, and they all focus on services that decide to moderate or remove content. It could be expansions to Section 230, new legislative frameworks, or a commitment to industry-wide self-regulation best practices, requiring 1, moderation process and practices to be published, 2, a straightforward process to appeal decisions, and 3, best efforts around algorithmic choice are suggestions to address the concerns we all have going forward. And they're all achievable in short order. It's critical as we consider these solutions, we optimize for new startups and independent developers. Doing so ensures a level playing field that increases the probability of competing ideas to help solve problems going forward. We mustn't entrench the largest companies any further. Finally, before I close, I wanted to share some reflections on what we saw during the US presidential election. We focused on addressing attempts to undermine civic integrity, providing informative context, and product changes to encourage greater conversation. We updated our civic integrity policy to address misleading or disputed information that undermines confidence in the election, causes voter intimidation or suppression or confusion about how to vote, or misrepresents affiliation or election outcomes. More than a year ago, the public asked us to offer additional context to help make potentially misleading information more apparent. We did exactly that, applying labels to over 300,000 tweets from October 27th to November 11th, which represented about 2.2% of all US election-related tweets. We also changed how our product works in order to help increase context and encourage more thoughtful consideration before tweets are shared broadly. We're continuing to assess the impact of these product changes to inform our long-term roadmap. Well, thank you for the time. I look forward to a productive discussion focused on solutions.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Mr. Zuckerberg.
Thank you, Chairman Graham, Ranking Member Blumenthal, and members of the committee. At last month's hearing, I spoke about the role internet platforms play in supporting democracy, keeping people safe, and upholding fundamental values like free expression. People have deeply held beliefs about these issues and can reach very different conclusions about the right balance. We try to do what's best for our community and the world, acknowledging that there are difficult trade-offs. I believe that some of these trade-offs and decisions would be better made through a democratic process, and I look forward to discussing that today. But first, I want to update you on our efforts during the election. At Facebook, we took our responsibility to protect the integrity of this election very seriously. In 2016, we began to face new kinds of threats, and after years of preparation, we were ready to defend against them. We've built sophisticated systems to protect against election interference that combine artificial intelligence, significant human review, and partnerships with the intelligence community, law enforcement, and other tech platforms. We've taken down more than 100 networks of bad actors who are trying to coordinate and interfere globally. We established a network of independent fact checkers that covers more than 60 languages. We made political advertising more transparent on Facebook than anywhere else, and including TV, radio, and email. And we introduced new policies to combat voter suppression and misinformation. Still, the pandemic created new challenges: how to handle misinformation about COVID and voting by mail, how to prepare people for the reality that results would take time, and how to handle if someone prematurely declared victory or refused to accept the result. So in September, we updated our policies again to reflect these realities of voting in 2020 and make sure that we were taking precautions given these unique circumstances. We worked with local election officials to remove false claims about polling conditions that might lead to voter suppression. We partnered with Reuters and the National Election Pool to provide reliable information about results. We attached voting information to posts by candidates on both sides and additional contexts to posts trying to delegitimize the outcome. We locked down new political ads in the week before the election to prevent misleading claims from spreading when they couldn't be rebutted. We strengthened our enforcement against militias and conspiracy networks like QAnon to prevent them from using our platforms to organize violence or civil unrest. Altogether, I believe this was the largest election integrity effort by any private company in recent times. This is what people expect of us. And I'm glad that from what we've seen so far, our systems performed well. But election interference remains an ongoing threat that will never fully be solved, so we continue to improve with each election. But our integrity work is really only half the story. We also ran an unprecedented civic engagement program to encourage people to take part in our democracy. We ran the largest voter information campaign in history. 140 million people visited our voting information center, including more than 33 million on election day alone. We estimate that we helped more than 4.5 million people register to vote and helped states recruit 100,000 poll workers. This was done in a transparent and nonpartisan way as part of our ongoing commitment to supporting the civic process. And on top of these efforts by Facebook, my wife Priscilla and I personally donated $400 million to support election officials around the country in making sure that they had the infrastructure they needed to enable everyone to vote safely during this pandemic. In my last testimony, I said that people would judge us by our performance during this election. And I believe that the full story is not only how we handled bad behavior on our platforms, but also how we encouraged civic engagement more broadly. I'm proud of the work we've done to support our democracy, and I look forward to discussing this. I also welcome the opportunity to discuss internet regulation. I believe we are well overdue to update the rules for the internet around content, elections, privacy, and data portability. There are important questions here, including who should be responsible for what people say online. For any system to work, I believe there needs to be a transparent process that people feel they can trust. And this will be difficult, especially since our country is so divided, but I believe it's the only way to address these issues for the long term. The challenges that we face are deeper than any one platform. They're about how we want to balance basic social equities that we all care about, like free expression, public safety, and privacy. This is why I believe we would benefit from clearer guidance from elected officials, and I look forward to discussing this today.
Well, thank you both. We'll have one round and 7 minutes, but I'll, as always, try to be a little bit liberal with the time because it's a very important topic. So let's just get right into it. Mr. Dorsey, you can go first, then Mr. Zuckerberg. When you heard Senator Blumenthal's opening statement and mine, what did you get from it?
Well, I think you pointed out that we are facing something that feels impossible. We are required to help increase the health of the public conversation, while at the same time ensuring that as many people as possible can participate. And in order to do so, we need to make policies so that people feel safe and they feel free to express themselves, to minimize threats of abuse, of harassment, of misleading information, of organized campaigns to artificially amplify or influence a particular conversation. And that policy creation, that enforcement is challenging, but also it is more or less opaque to the public. And that's where I think we have a gap. We have transparency around our policies. We do not have transparency around how we operate content moderation, the rationale behind it, the reasoning. And as we look forward, we have more and more of our decisions, of our operations, moving to algorithms, which have a difficult time explaining why they make decisions, bringing transparency around those decisions. And that is why we believe that we should have more choice in how these algorithms are applied to our content, whether we use them at all, so we can turn them on or off, and have clarity around the outcomes that they are projecting and how they affect our experience.
Thank you. Mr. Zuckerberg, very quickly, please. What did you hear?
Senator, I heard that there are issues around content moderation, as well as other areas. And frankly, I'm optimistic from the statements that we may be able to move forward and hopefully update some of the rules for the internet around these areas. I've been encouraging and hoping that we would do this for a couple of years. And from your opening statements, it sounds like there may be now enough common ground on views that real progress can be made here.
So from my point of view, the question for us is, when it comes time to flag content as being reliable or not reliable, do either one of you believe that the government should do that? Is that a solution where the government sets a regulatory scheme that talks about what should be up and what should be down?
I don't believe so. I think that would be very challenging.
Okay. Do you agree with that, Mr. Zuckerberg?
Senator, for certain types of illegal content, I think it may be appropriate for there to be clear rules around that. But outside of clear harms, including things like child exploitation in areas like that, terrorism, I would agree with your sentiment that that's not something that government should be deciding on a piece of content by piece of content basis.
So if we take the government out of the picture, at least in non-criminal areas, should we leave it up to the industry to come up with best business practices in terms of how to moderate content?
I think that's best. I think we need to align around the problem that we're trying to solve. And there are many solutions to solving those problems, but I think we also have to focus our efforts on what is going to have the greatest impact. And we believe that the greatest impact is going to be found in how we deal with algorithms, how we use those algorithms, because they are responsible for showing us what we see or what we don't see. And there needs to be more choice in their use.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Zuckerberg?
Senator, I think that there is a role for regulation in the process, even if not defining on a piece of content by piece of content basis. And one of the areas that I've advocated for is regulation around transparency. that goes beyond just about what the policies are and what the process is, but also goes towards results. And as an example of this, every quarter, Facebook releases a community standards enforcement report. It's basically a transparency report that breaks down each category of potentially harmful content that we track, ranging from terrorism to child exploitation content to incitement of violence to pornography to intellectual property violations.
Yes, if I may, I don't mean to interrupt, but who sets those community standards? How are they set by the company?
Senator, we have a policy team that consults with a number of different stakeholders and outside groups to make sure that we're getting feedback from broad swaths of our community covering all of the concerns.
Is that publicly known?
Senator, I believe so. And our head of content policy has testified publicly multiple times.
Okay. So when it comes to fact checking, would you give us a list of the people you use to fact check?
Senator, yes. We work with a number of independent organizations that are accredited by the Poynter Institute, and they include Reuters, the Associated Press, Agence France Presse, United States, USA Today, factcheck.org, Science Feedback, PolitiFact, Check Your Fact, Lead Stories, and The Dispatch in the United States.
Okay, I think it's important for the public to know who sets community standards, how they're set, who does the fact checking, who you rely upon to do that. I think that would go a long way to people having a better understanding of the decisions you make. Mr. Zuckerberg, do you believe your product can be addictive?
Senator, we certainly do not design the product in that way. We design the product to be as useful and meaningful as possible.
That's not my question. My question is that there seems to be an ample body of growing medical evidence that social media sites have an addictive nature to them. Do you agree with that?
Senator, I don't think the research has been conclusive, but it is an area that we care about and study. We certainly do not want our products to be addictive. We want people to use them because they are meaningful. And we take steps to make sure that this is the case. So for example, we don't give the team that's running newsfeed a goal around how much time people spend on our products, which goes counter to a lot of the memes and misinformation out there around how we operate. But my goal is to help people connect and find content and interactions that are going to be meaningful to them on our service. And our view is that if that's what we deliver over the long term and people find the services useful, then they'll use them more. But I don't think that companies should be optimizing to just encourage people to spend as much time as possible on them.
Well, time's about up. Have you seen the movie Social Dilemma?
Senator, I'm familiar with it.
Okay, have you seen it, Mr. Dorsey?
No, I have not.
I would encourage both of you to see it. So here's what I think we're going to do on the committee over time, I hope, is to ask the question more directly, are these social media sites addictive? Do they have a public health component that needs to be addressed? For years, we thought tobacco was a great thing. We found out tobacco was not such a great thing. The medical science around these websites are becoming very concerning to me, particularly among children, and that you can manipulate how many times you watch. And you can set these media sites up so that people will constantly interact. So to both of you, I appreciate coming before the committee. We've got a long way to go. I don't think the government needs to regulate what we think or what we say, but we've got to up our game here. And I'll end with this last question. Do both of you support change to 230, reform of Section 230?
Senator, I do.
Mr. Dorsey?
Yes.
Thank you. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Let me bring this down to very practical terms. We're in the middle of another election. This election in Georgia could determine in fact, which party controls the United States Senate. I'm concerned that both of your companies are in fact backsliding or retrenching, that you are failing to take action against dangerous disinformation, exactly the same kind of voter suppression tactics that existed in the last election, and that you are in fact reducing content modification. The fighting words and hate speech in the last election could inflame violence and send poll workers into hiding, discourage people from coming to the polls. We have to expect the same kinds of malign tactics. In fact, they are already visible, and I'm going to ask, Mr. Chairman, that these posts and tweets be entered into the record, if there's no objection, that are aimed at delegitimizing the election in January. My question to you is, will you commit to the same kind of robust content modification playbook in this coming election, including fact-checking, labeling, reducing the spread of misinformation, and other steps, even for politicians in the runoff elections ahead?
Senator, our policy is to have a similar approach in the upcoming Georgia special elections that we took during the general election.
Mr. Dorsey?
Yes, we do. We intend to learn from all of our experience with this election and bring all that learning going forward to make it more robust.
During the past election, there was rampant disinformation on social media in Spanish-speaking sites, repeating QAnon conspiracies and false claims of election rigging. In my view, you need to do better. Will you commit to taking steps to improve content modification for Spanish-speaking communities before the Georgia runoff?
Senator, this is something that we are already working on and worked on ahead of the general election. We have multiple fact checkers who focus on the Spanish as a language, and we made sure that we translated our voter information center into Spanish, which we showed at the top of Facebook and Instagram to everyone who uses those products in Spanish in the U.S. Those are a couple of the steps that we've taken, and we're certainly committed to focusing on this.
And yes, we will, and in partnership with Latinx civil rights groups.
I'd like to know, and perhaps you could submit to me within 1 week, what additional steps you're going to take, because this Georgia runoff is underway. And as I've indicated, I've seen a backsliding and retrenchment that is very deeply troubling, that have enabled the spread of this disinformation, the restarting of certain algorithms, for example, that promote or amplify misinformation is very, very troubling. And I think I want to know within a week what additional steps we're taking to enhance the efforts to stop this kind of amplification and spread. Let me ask about Facebook community standards, which ban language that, quote, incites or facilitates serious violence. As you know, on November 5th, Steve Bannon, in a Facebook Live video, called for beheadings of Dr. Fauci and FBI Director Wray for not acting more favorably toward President Trump. Twitter banned Bannon for these remarks. You removed the video, Mr. Zuckerberg, but on Thursday, you reportedly told Facebook employees that Bannon had not violated enough policies that he should be banned from Facebook. My question to you is, how many times has Steve Bannon allowed the call for the murder of government officials before Facebook suspends his account?
Senator, as you say, the content in question did violate our policies and we took it down. Having a content violation does not automatically mean your account gets taken down, and the number of strikes varies depending on the type of offense. So if people are posting terrorist content or child exploitation content, then the first time that they do it, then we will take down their account. For other things, it's multiple. I'd be happy to follow up afterwards. We try not to disclose these.
Down his account?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Will you commit to taking down that account, Steve Bannon's account?
Senator, no, that's not what our policies would suggest that we should do in this case.
According to the internal records that are on the record now, leaked by NBC News, Facebook has removed fact checks and forgiven infractions for conservative pages and pundits such as Breitbart, Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump, and Gateway Pundit, based on a fear of accusations of bias. Has Facebook avoided penalizing or fact-checking conservative pages that had violated its policies based on concerns of political bias and allegations of bias?
Senator, no, we haven't done that. And I think that those reports mischaracterize the actions that we take. I'm not aware of any instance where we have overturned a fact check specifically. And certainly no action like that would be taken for the reasons that you're saying. What we do sometimes is apply some judgment on whether the repeat offender policies would render too harsh of a penalty, but that's different from overturning a specific fact check, and is not done for the reasons that you said.
Well, I'm very concerned that, in fact, Facebook seems to have a record of making accommodations and caving to conservative pressure, and the president has tried to use an executive order on Section 230 to again bully or browbeat and exert pressure on you and others in this industry. They're, in effect, working the refs and they're winning. Let me ask you about antitrust issues. In 2013, Facebook bought Onavo, which is a virtual private records network that claimed to protect users' privacy. In fact, Onavo's access to private information about its users provided Facebook with unparalleled ability to track potential competition. I want to know whether Facebook used data from Onavo when it decided to purchase WhatsApp in 2014.
Senator, I believe that data from Onavo was one of the sources that the team looked at, but I don't think it would have taken using Onavo to understand that WhatsApp was a great product. And I don't think that was determinative in my decision to pursue that.
Well, in fact, the House antitrust report says Onavo data was used to determine whether WhatsApp was, quote, killing Facebook Messenger, end quote. My time has almost expired, but let me just say finally that antitrust action by the Federal Trade Commission is long overdue. I believe that decisive action is necessary, including very likely breaking up Facebook as a remedy. All options ought to be on the table, including divestment of Instagram and WhatsApp. The FTC ought to impose strict conditions on how Facebook uses consumer data and competes with rivals, because the abuse of competition must end. Mr. Chairman, I asked that 3 letters from civil rights groups regarding disinformation and hate speech on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and also a letter from a coalition of children's protection advocates on the Earn It Act and child sexual abuse material on digital platforms be entered into the record. Thank you both for being here today.
Without
Thank you, sir.
objection, Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm glad to hear both of our witnesses today say that Section 230, that they are open to reform, because I think it's fair to say the internet has outgrown Section 230. And while we've made some modifications when it comes to terrorism and when it comes to child exploitation, I think there's more to do. But I think the question is going to be how this regulation is going to come to pass. I know there's some, including on this committee, who suggest that maybe we ought to create a private right of action so that individuals can sue over claims of violated rights on your platforms. I think that's one form of regulation. It's called regulation by litigation, but it's certainly not my first choice, and it's not optimal. And I don't think it's something we ought to be embracing in the first instance. But I do think it's critical that each of you and your counterparts work with us to try to come up with something that will address the concerns. And the basic concern I have is it's hard to know exactly how to classify your business model. It's we have a provision in the Bill of Rights protecting freedom of the press, but yet here, while we would never let the government regulate what the press writes or doesn't write, essentially we are allowing private companies, which are now de facto public forums, to regulate that speech. And I'm no more comfortable delegating those decisions to you than I am delegating to you my vote in the last or upcoming elections. You know, Louis Brandeis famously said that the solution for bad speech is not less speech, it's more speech. And it seems to me like the practices that you are engaging in to tag, remove, and otherwise censor speech on your platforms violates that principle. And I'd like to know why that shouldn't be a better approach by allowing more speech rather than censoring what is perceived as bad speech. And then, as I think I've discussed with you, Mr. Zuckerberg, I think we're all sort of struggling to come up with what the appropriate analogy here is to your business model. We know as newspapers have become less profitable and many of them gone out of business, there's been consolidation in the news media. There is a proliferation of cable TV shows and people being able to get information through a variety of sources, but there's no Walter Cronkite or the big TV networks that with the trusted anchor person who people have confidence in, that they will shoot with them straight. And so I know it's a very difficult thing to manage, but I would just encourage both of you not to wait for the lawsuits. We saw what happened to Microsoft. I think Bill Gates said that was one of his biggest mistakes, failing to engage with some of the antitrust concerns when it came to Microsoft. And he learned that the hard way. And I think there is a better way for the American people, and that's if we work on this together. Mr. Zuckerberg, I believe that Facebook publishes on a quarterly basis a report of its actions in this area. Is that correct?
Senator, that's correct.
And could you describe that for us and what motivated you to undertake that sort of transparency?
Yes. Senator, I believe that in order for people to trust that we're doing a good job, they have to be able to see the results. And we have to be able to break down on a content on a kind of category by category basis across all the different categories of harm, whether it's terrorist content or child exploitation or incitement of violence or pornography or intellectual property violations, how much of the violating content is on our platforms and how effective our systems are at removing it. And what we hold ourselves accountable towards is getting as high a percent of this harmful content down, addressing it, before real people have to experience it and report it to us themselves. So in categories where we do quite well, for example, in fighting against terrorist content, our AI systems and counterterrorism teams are able to remove 98 or 99% of that harmful content before anyone has to report it to us. In other categories, it's more challenging and we're still making more progress. But I think that as part of a regulatory framework here, it would be good if every company had to issue a transparency report outlining what they're seeing on their platforms and the results and effectiveness of their content moderation systems. So that way, the people who are responsible for holding all of us accountable, whether it's journalists, Congress, academics, could have an apples to apples comparison about how all the different companies are doing, and potentially, as part of a law, require that companies even maintain a certain level of effectiveness.
Thank you. Mr. Dorsey, when Twitter decided to take down the story, the New York Post story on Hunter Biden's laptop, did you do that under your terms of service, or did you do it under some other claim of authority?
We did it under our terms of service, which, as you know, everyone agrees to when they sign up for Twitter. And this was a policy around distribution of hacked materials. We did not want Twitter to be a distribution point for hacked materials.
Well, you do realize that by taking down that story, you probably gave it more prominence and more visibility than it ever would have gotten had you left it alone.
We realize that, and we recognize it as a mistake that we made, both in terms of the intention of the policy and also the enforcement action of not allowing people to share it publicly or privately, which is why we corrected it within 24 hours.
And Mr. Dorsey, why isn't Justice Brandeis's formulation in Whitney versus California, why shouldn't that apply to the internet platforms like yours? In other words, the cure for bad speech is not censorship, it's more speech. Why wouldn't that principle apply to Twitter?
I think it does apply. All of our policies are focused on encouraging more speech. What we saw and what the market told us was that people would not put up with abuse, harassment, and misleading information that would cause offline harm. And they would leave our service because of it. So our intention is to create clear policy, clear enforcement that enables people to feel that they can express themselves on our service and ultimately trust it.
So it was a business decision.
It was a business decision.
Thank you.
Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dorsey, in recent hearings before the Senate Commerce Committee, you said, I think, that Twitter has a policy against misinformation relating to civic integrity. President Trump and his allies have tweeted hundreds of false claims about the 2020 election. Trump has falsely claimed victory and alleged widespread voter fraud. So here's the question. Does misinformation about the results of an election and voter fraud relate to civic integrity? Why or why not?
Yes, it does. And we label those tweets when the election has not been called yet, or multiple sources have called it differently.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. Did you say you have been able to tweet?
No, we have labeled the tweets that would indicate a different result in the election, called by multiple sources.
I see. At what point was that done?
Throughout the period, October 11th to up till today.
So when the tweet was initially came in, how long was it before you, quote, updated it?
We didn't update it. We put a label on it pointing to the broader conversation. Our goal is to connect people with more information around what's happening with the election. And that was, and that occurred anywhere from 5 minutes to 30 minutes, but as quickly as we can.
Thank you. Is 30 minutes the maximum time?
I don't know. We can get you that information.
Would
We'll follow
you,
up.
I'm interested in this. Does misinformation about the results of an election and voter fraud relate to civic integrity? Why or why not?
Yes, it does. And we also label those tweets that would indicate whether fraud was happening. And again, we connect those to larger conversations on the platform. So we want to provide context here. That is our goal, providing more context, providing more information.
Okay, now a specific question, and I'm not sure actually what the answer to this should be, but on November 7, President Trump tweeted, and I quote, "I won this election by a lot," end quote. Obviously, that's not true. President Trump lost the election. The warning label that Twitter has applied to the tweet says, and I quote, "Official sources may not have called the race when this was tweeted," end quote. Do you believe that label goes far enough to prevent the tweet's harms when the tweet is still visible and not accurate?
I do, because it's not just the surface level label. It points to a collection of news articles, of information and conversation that gives you an expansion on what's happening with the election.
I guess you see, my concerns are that these tweets arouse people. And it seems to me that the entity that runs this operation ought to have an understanding that when there is a major situation, that the tweets can play a unique role in either reassuring or stirring people up to unacceptable levels. Could you comment on that?
Well, I agree in spirit. I mean, our policy is focused on misleading information around the election and the civic process to provide greater context, to provide additive information so that people can make decisions around what's happening within the election. And that is 3 phases. That's the run up to the election, that's election day, and also the phase we're in right now, post-election. So our policies and enforcement are focused on providing more information, more context to people in those 3 phases.
Well, let me give you a specific. On November 7, President Trump tweeted this: "I won this election by a lot," end quote. That's obviously not true. President Trump lost the election. The warning label that Twitter has applied to the tweet says, and I quote, "Official sources may not have called the race when this was tweeted," end quote. Now, here's the question. Does that label do enough to prevent the tweet's harms when the tweet is still visible and is not accurate?
I believe it's really important that we show people a broader context, and that is the intention of the label. It is not just text below a tweet. It is a link to connect to a much larger conversation and news articles across the spectrum.
Well, give me an example of what would have to happen before the situation would warrant a stronger response.
Well, we did have stronger responses during election day and the week after, where we did put an interstitial, meaning that you had to click through to see the content of the tweet, and it limited spread for anything that went against our civic integrity policy, including premature calls to election results.
Well, let me give you one more. On November 12, President Trump tweeted a conspiracy theory that 2.7 million votes for him were deleted. The warning label that Twitter has applied to that tweet said, quote, "This claim about election fraud is disputed." Now, here's the question, and I think it is a tough issue. Do you believe this label does enough to prevent the tweet's harms? When the tweet is still visible, it's a highly emotional situation, but the tweet has no factual basis.
But the tweet has a link to more information, to more conversation and more context that informs the situation, what's happening. So I do believe that connecting people to the larger conversation, giving them more context, is the right path here.
But they have to move to solicit that contact, right? It's not contained as an addendum to the original tweet.
The label is an addendum to the original tweet, and if you tap on it or click it, you will go to an expansion of the information.
I see. Can I ask a question, Mr. Zuckerberg? Is he?
Yes, you may, if you, one
Thank
more,
you.
if that'd be okay.
Mr. Zuckerberg, at the recent hearing before the Senate Commerce Committee, you said that Facebook has a, quote, policy in place that prevents any candidate, end quote, from, quote, trying to delegitimize the result of the election, end quote. But the hashtags steal the vote and voter fraud garnered more than 300,000 interactions on your platform in the hours after Mr. Trump falsely declared victory. So here's the question. Do you believe Facebook did enough to prevent Trump's efforts to delegitimize the election result? If so, why have you reached that conclusion?
Senator, I believe that we've taken some very significant steps in this area, not just the adding additional context to specific posts and making it so that when people search for different hashtags, we show additional information. But we also took the unprecedented step of putting the Voter Information Center at the top of Facebook and Instagram for everyone in the US that showed them reliable information about the election, including partnering with organizations like Reuters and the National Election Pool to show them accurate information about the results of the election. So all taken together, I think that we really went quite far in terms of helping to distribute reliable and accurate information about what was going on during this election.
Okay, let me give you one more along this line. After President Trump falsely claimed that the election was being stolen, a group called Stop the Steal was started on Facebook. It grew to more than 300,000 users in less than a day, making it one of the fastest growing groups, I understand, in Facebook history. You shut the group down, but substantial damage already had been done. Trump supporters, some of them armed with assault weapons, held Stop the Steal rallies outside election offices. In Philadelphia, 2 armed supporters who had traveled from Virginia were arrested on their way to the city's vote counting center. Here's the question, and this is a tough one. What are your concerns about the spread of misinformation, no matter how innocent it is, or it is not innocent, like Trump's claims about the election, that they may incite violence?
Senator, I'm very worried about this, especially any misinformation or content that could incite violence. And during such a volatile period like this, one of our top priorities is making sure that people don't use our platform to organize any violence or civil unrest. And that was the basis under which we took down that group, because there were a number of members who were posting potentially violent or encouraging violent comments that violated our policies. We also have broader policies in place around trying to slow the spread of misinformation more broadly, even when it's not going to lead to some kind of violence or imminent harm. And that's why we've created this independent fact-checking program where we work with more than 80 partners around the world to help to help do fact checking, because people in our community have told us they don't want to see misinformation, but they also don't want us to be deciding what is true and false. So we've taken the step of building this program, which I believe is more sophisticated than what anyone else in our industry has. So I'm very focused on these issues.
Well, I'm happy to hear that because I'm really struck by it, that people armed with assault weapons as a product of a tweet could rally outside an election office. And I think it's really a serious issue that needs to be considered. And there need to be, once you signal that and people respond to it, it has to be in some way abated or some way pointed out or restructured on the internet itself. Now, can you respond to that?
Senator Feinstein,
And
I
concerns?
hate to, we're almost double the time. Could we,
I'm sorry.
that's all right. We're going to have a vote come up and I apologize. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to note that as far as the president's arguments about the election and how they turned out, inciting violence, I'd like to point out here that the only violence that I'm aware of has occurred in connection with Antifa. Antifa's response to pro-Trump peaceful rally attenders. So I don't quite understand that. Maybe we'll have a chance to dwell on that more in a minute. But first, I want to talk a little bit about federal law, existing federal law and what it requires. Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act prohibits businesses from engaging in unfair or deceptive trade practices. Compliance with this particular law requires that there be some consistency between what a company represents as their practices and their products and what they actually are. In other words, you can't sell one thing and provide another under the guise of providing something different than what's being sold. Both Twitter and Facebook represent and have represented for years to their users, their customers, that they take a neutral approach to election content moderation. However, as we've heard today, and as we will continue to hear today and into the foreseeable future, there are instances in which your platforms are taking a very distinctively partisan approach and not a neutral one to election-related content moderation. For example, just days before the election, Twitter suspended the account of Mark Morgan. Now, Mark Morgan is the commissioner of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Office. And they suspended Commissioner Morgan's Twitter account, specifically for a tweet celebrating the success of the U.S. southern border wall. Apparently, Commissioner Morgan's tweet, his comments about the border wall, violated Twitter platform rules governing what it calls hateful conduct. Now, I've read the offending post, and the offending post from Commissioner Mark Morgan reads as follows. At CBP and the Army Corps of Engineers, continue to build new wall every day. Every mile helps us stop gang members, murderers, sexual predators, and drugs from entering our country. It's a fact. Walls work. Period. Close quote. Mr. Dorsey, can you tell me in one sentence, what exactly is hateful about Commissioner Morgan's tweet that I just read?
Well, we evaluated this tweet again, and we found that we were wrong. That was a mistake, and it was due to the fact that we had heightened awareness around government accounts during this time. So that was a mistake. We reverted it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And we're going to get back to more of that in a minute and get back to the fact that, I understand that mistakes happen. But what we're going to see today is that mistakes happen a whole lot more, almost entirely on one side of the political aisle rather than the other. Now, Commissioner Morgan's statement in that tweet, as was initially taken down, is factual. There's nothing remotely hateful about it, and yet it was taken down. Now, on October 15th, Facebook relied on a third-party fact checker's assessment to ban 2 advertisements from Facebook for, quote, partly false information. Now, both of these advertisements were factual in nature. They revealed Joe Biden's and Kamala Harris's views on late-term abortion. Joe Biden has stated that he won't accept any restrictions on abortion, and Senator Harris's views are such that she voted against requiring care for a child born alive during a botched abortion. The very next day, the third-party fact checker issued a statement retracting the assessment and retracting it as erroneous. However, it stunningly took Facebook almost 2 more weeks until October 29th, when voting had already started in many jurisdictions, to lift the ban on these legitimate ads. Ads that the fact checker had already declared a couple weeks earlier were erroneously taken down. So, Mr. Zuckerberg, why on earth did it take Facebook 2 weeks to correct this error?
Senator, I'm not familiar with the details of us re-enabling that ad, so I can follow up with you after. It's possible that this was just a mistake or delay, and unfortunately, when we handle millions or billions of pieces of content a day, while we strive to do as well as possible and be as precise as possible, we will make some mistakes.
Thank you. I appreciate your acknowledgement of the fact that there are mistakes. As I've noted previously, those mistakes sure happen a whole lot more on one side of the political spectrum than the other. Now, this is understandable. We're humans, but it's also understandable why this might occur. Maybe some of it has to do with your employees. 92.83% of Facebook employees who donated to federal candidates gave to Democrats. At Twitter, it's even more stark than that, as if it could get much more stark, but 99.3% of Twitter employees who donated to federal candidates gave to Democrats. And so these mistakes, they may be mistakes, but they're mistakes that rhyme. They may not repeat themselves, but they rhyme. And the consistent theme happens to be Republicans, conservatives, and pro-life activists. Now, I'd like to ask both of you, is there a list of every user or every content creator who has been deplatformed or had their contents reach altered or have had some other adverse action taken by either Facebook or Twitter altered? Is there some list that identifies each user for which that has happened? Mr. Zuckerberg, let's hear from you. Just a yes or no question. Does such a list exist?
Senator, I'm not aware of anything like that existing.
Mr. Dorsey, how about you?
Not exactly sure what you're asking, but
Yeah.
we certainly.
Simple question. Do you have a list of people, your users or content creators who have had some adverse action taken against them, either being deplatformed or having their reach altered or something because of the content of their posts?
Well, certainly whenever we take an action, it's recorded somewhere in a database, but I'm not sure if that's your intent.
No, that's helpful. So what I'm hearing from both of you is that while there may not be an actual list, and I'd like you both to check to see if such a list exists, but even if there isn't, there is a de facto list because you have within your databases records of occasions when this has occurred. And so I'd like to ask both of you, if such a list exists, please send it to me. I'd like to see it. If such a list does not exist, you certainly do have the data necessary in order to generate some. And I request as a member of this committee that you generate such a list and provide it to me. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Senator Graham, the chairman of the committee, has stepped out momentarily. I've been directed to recess the hearing momentarily so that we can go and vote, and then we will pick up back here in just a few minutes. I would like to, as long as I have the gavel momentarily, I'm going to ask one more question before I leave to go vote, and then we'll recess the hearing after this question.
And could I ask when we're coming back? I've been waiting to ask questions for an hour now.
Yeah, will be coming back as soon as Senator Graham returns. He left to vote in just a moment ago. He'll be back. Mr. Zuckerberg, in September, Facebook tagged an ad run by the American Principles Project in Michigan that criticized Joe Biden and criticized Senator Gary Peters. And the ad was tagged because it was quote unquote missing context. Now, the next day, the ad was shut down entirely by Facebook. Facebook relied on a supposed fact check from PolitiFact, which is a nice way for you to avoid taking accountability for the problem, except that the fact check in question literally said that the ad, quote, makes, quote, predictions we can't fact check. Apparently, this had to do with lacking context. So when did lacking context become a new standard for political ads? I mean, all political ads, all ads in general, but certainly all political ads lack context. Ben Sass just finished a resounding victory in Nebraska. And I haven't seen his TV ads, but I'm sure they're brilliant. This guy's made for television. He's with or without the beard. And I'm sure his ads didn't say, Ben Sass, great senator, but not that great of a hockey player. Or there's always context that is lacked out, that is lacking, left out in any advertisement. So what does that mean? And have you applied the missing context label to any Democratic ads, a single one that you can identify?
Senator, I'm not familiar with that specific standard, but as kind of a background on the fact-checking program, the basis of this is that we have heard resoundingly from our community that people do not want to see misinformation and believe that it is a problem. But people also believe that they do not want Facebook to be the arbiter of truth in deciding everything that is true and false. And for what it's worth, I strongly agree with that. And I do not think it is the right thing for us to assume that role. So within those bounds, we've tried to create a fact-checking program that works with independent third parties who have been accredited by the Poynter Institute for Journalism, which I think is widely respected. And we give those fact checkers the latitude to determine whether ads or other content on our service is accurate. And if not, we apply some demotions or we prevent them from being run as ads. I can follow up in more detail afterwards on the specifics of your questions, since I'm not as familiar with them right now.
I would appreciate that very much if you'd be willing to do that, because it's not only inconsistent with logic and with what the standards that apply in every other advertising context that I'm familiar with. It's also inconsistent with what Facebook itself does. Just to give you some context for that, while we're talking about missing context, I recently posted something about the election on Facebook. And my Facebook post was almost immediately tagged with the following, quote, election officials say that voter fraud, which is historically rare, has not affected the outcome in this election. They have confirmed that mail-in voting was conducted in accordance with state voting rules, close quote. Now, I find this a little disturbing. Tag to me sounds a whole lot more like state-run media announcing the party line rather than a neutral company, as it purports to be, running an open online forum. This kind of editorializing insulates people from the truth, and it insinuates that anyone concerned about voter fraud must be crazy. It also states it as if it were an irrefutable, neutral, objective fact. Now, maybe these kinds of concerns are out of the mainstream in Palo Alto, but they're not out of the mainstream with the rest of America. I have to reiterate, I hope this kind of manipulation wasn't intentional, but it's getting harder and harder for me to accept the premise that it could be anything but intentional. And if it was intentional, it's yet more evidence that Facebook's actions surrounding this election are incongruent with the promises that you've made to your own users. And that's a problem. Consistent with the directions I've been given by Chairman Graham, we're now going to recess. I predict we'll be in recess for no more than 10 or 15 minutes until Chairman Graham returns. We stand in recess.
Yeah, I've actually, people play room ball. Whenever people have throwing out room ball games, which is basically hockey,